You're listening to the Joe and Rosa Show, proclaiming the gospel through word and through song.
Hi, and welcome to the Joe and Rosa Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Rosa.
And with us today we have Amy Carroll, Proverbs 31 speaker and author of the book Breaking Up with Perfect. How you doing, Amy?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me with you today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. I see in your book you have some lists and how they define us, the good girl list and the never good enough list. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, the way I define the good girl list is it's the list that it's all the things that we think we have to do to measure up and to earn people's love and acceptance. And unfortunately for me, I've kind of lived by that list, and God got lumped into that too. It was kind of how I thought I needed to earn God's love and acceptance. And then the never good enough girl list is the list of things that we have in our past that we're ashamed of, that we're pretty sure we can never live down and learn to be enough to earn people's love and acceptance. And it's funny because when I wrote the book, it was pretty defined, and I thought, well, I've got the good girl list, and I know other friends that have the never good enough list. But a friend of mine talked to me about, she said, well, I swing between the two. And when she said that, I realized that I do too, that really, as far as achievement and things like that, I kind of hold the good girl list. And then in social settings, sometimes I fall into that never good enough list setting.
So you write in your book that these lists, that they create distance between us and Father God and between us and other people. Can you explain this in a little more depth, please?
Exactly. Well, especially for good girls, it's one of those things where we have to hold other people at arm's length, because if they get too close to us, they're going to know that we're not perfect. And we think we have to be perfect to earn that love and acceptance. For never good enough girls, they tend to hide because there's a lot of shame involved. And again, the conversations that I've had after writing the book have been so interesting. For a lot of never good enough girls, for some of them, it's things in their past that they're ashamed of, but a lot of girls that hold that list have had the list handed to them, either through a parent who should have nurtured them, or even sometimes by our culture, whether you wear the right clothes or your skin is the right color in the setting that you're in, or all kinds of ways that we can get handed that nasty list.
Yeah, and so God actually becomes a taskmaster because of these lists. And you say that basically we come to believe as his children that he dispenses his love to us in relation to how well we perform. That sounds like dangerous ground to tread on. Can you tell us some more about that?
Well, it absolutely is dangerous ground, and it really brought me to a place. This is kind of was my crisis, my place of crisis. Several things happened, but one of them was I was a woman in ministry. I was speaking for Proverbs 31. I was writing and doing all these things, but I had gotten to the place where I felt numb inside. I really just couldn't feel God's love anymore, because I had, even though I would have told you differently, because I know what Scripture says about God's love, deep down, I really did have this feeling that I had to earn it. And so I got to this place where I was just numb. I couldn't feel God's love for me anymore, but I was plowing through doing my work for him. And that's kind of one of the big differences is instead of living with him, that we're living for him. And that's, living for him sounds virtuous, and that's a big problem with all this perfectionism, is that it looks virtuous on the outside, but it can just kill our soul by drips on the inside.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of us relate to that. It makes me think, just what comes to my mind is in Revelation, where Jesus is speaking to one of the churches, and he says, I know your deeds, that I know that you've been faithful, but you've lost that first love, that we're doing, but something inside just isn't right. And so this brings me to an exercise that you spoke about in your book that I found very moving, and it happened while you were in India. Can you just walk us through it? Just tell us what happened and what God spoke to you through that exercise.
I would love to. Well, I had a mentor in my life that really confronted me with the fact that I was hiding behind a facade. And when she did that, it was it was kind of jolting to me because she did it in about 5 minutes, and I was like, how do you know that about me? I said this through my sobs because she had just nailed it on the head. And she said, because I'm like you. And so she really started to encourage me to really seek God's love and to really know that I was loved by God. So I came back to her about 2 weeks later, and I said, okay, Ray, I've been singing songs about God's love, and I've been reading about God's love. I've been thinking about God's love, and I've been working so hard, but I still can't feel God's love. And she just kind of paused for a beat and looked at me, and she goes, Amy, do you realize what you just said? You just said you're working to feel God's love. She said, you can't work to feel God's love. You have to rest in God's love. She said, just pray for something that will break through to your heart. And she was so right. It was like there was a shell around my heart. Well, several weeks after that, I took a trip to India. And I've been 3 times now. I love India, and I learn huge lessons every time I go. But this time I was part of a group of women that we were leading women's retreats. And my friend Annette that went with me, she's this real creative type, and she came up with this idea to have these mock weddings. And at first, because I'm not a real creative type, I was a little skeptical. But in the second time that we did this wedding, what we would do is that we would line the women up in rows, and they were like the bridesmaids. And then one at a time, we would put a veil on their head and flowers in their hands, and they were to walk down the aisle between their sisters as their sisters prayed for them and envision Jesus, their bridegroom, at the end. And you can just imagine that in a culture where they have arranged marriages that aren't necessarily based on love, that this was a powerful exercise. And so one by one, the women walked down the aisle, and it was very moving. You could tears rolling down their face, and I was watching, and I was moved by the whole thing. But at the very end, my friend, one of my Indian friends, Babita, went over to this old woman who was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, curled up into a tiny ball. She was almost invisible. And she said, Auntie, it's your turn. And she got this old woman up who was so frail she could barely walk, and took her down to the end of the aisle, put the veil on her head, put the flowers in her hand. And about that time, the pastor's wife leaned over to me, and she said, Amy, this woman just gave her life to Jesus 2 weeks ago. She's lived her whole life in the fear and superstition of her, the religion she was brought up in, but she's been set free. And as I watched this woman, she was the most moved of anyone. I mean, tears pouring down her face as she walked down the aisle. Suddenly, I had this thought, this woman, and the pastor's wife also told me she's dying. And I thought, this woman has lived her whole life apart from Jesus. She's at the end of her life. She probably doesn't have the energy to do anything for him. And yet she's completely loved by him, and she has been set free. And in that moment, it was like the shell around my heart just broke. And I started sobbing. In fact, I found myself face down on the concrete floor, just sobbing, overcome by the power of God's love and having that shell broken away and realizing she didn't do anything for God, and he loves her completely, just like he loves each of us completely without us doing anything for him.
I think
it was a very powerful and freeing moment for me.
Oh, I can absolutely tell. I'm experiencing it, I think, through your words telling me about that, and it just seems like that is the absolute opposite from what we feel with all this pressure to perform and to produce perfection. And that takes us to your next chapter, where you talk about how Jesus produces perfection in us. What does that look like?
Well, that's the funny thing that I've been learning, is that only when I end my own pursuit of perfection can God even start his perfecting work in me. I mean, a lot of people after the book came out asked me, and they said, so you're telling me to embrace my imperfection? And I thought, oh, No, that's not really what I'm saying. So, because there is that kind of movement in our culture too, a backlash against the perfectionism of Pinterest and all the highlight reels on Facebook and that kind of thing. But what I'm really saying is that God does have a perfecting work to do in us, but it's so different than our own. I mean, my own, I'm so harsh on myself. I don't show grace to myself. I push myself to the point of exhaustion, whereas God's perfecting work in us and is so it's an internal work instead of all the external stuff we try to create. It's an internal work, and it's gentle, and it's humble, and it's kind and compassionate and full of grace. And so it's a completely different experience to give up my own perfectionism, which is, by the way, a process that I'm still in, and let God kind of surrender to God and his perfecting work he wants to do in us.
Wow. And so, yeah, and you're talking about that. It kind of goes along with then in chapter 4, you talk about image and that we have to present this image. And I think that goes along with that. And then it gets even worse, I think, as far as what this does to us, this whole seeking perfection. Because in chapter 5, you talk about that we don't connect with other people, that we try to find perfection through things. So that sounds even more isolating. What do you mean when you say that? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, especially in contrast with, I've just gotten back from India in the last few weeks, and our American culture in contrast with that is so obvious that we use our things to create a facade, to create perfectionism. And for different people, it's different things. Like I'm kind of cheap, to be real honest with you, and so I'll go to a thrift store in a skinny minute, and I know other girls use designer bags and all kinds of things to create that. For me, it was my house and wanting my house to look perfect, and so for different people, it's different things, but we were created for connecting, not for collecting. And we collect things and put things around us to create the facade that we're okay. And that it tends to be, I think, kind of an American thing that we do.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that then it becomes this quest for self-sufficiency so that we don't need anybody else and that we neglect community. And then this morphs, it goes into this avenue where we exchange perfect for friendship. In other words, we're choosing perfection over friendship, and we leave our friendships when they get messy. So you write that we need to be authentic instead. And I know I will be the first one to admit that when things are not perfect, when it gets messy and I feel like I've blown it, I feel like that's it. Friendship over, game over, you lose.
Yeah.
And so I know that this has to be something that many women are nodding their heads that they also feel. So tell us what we could do instead, because we are messy people, that instead of abandoning our...
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We certainly hope you join us same time, same channel next week for the rest of our interview with Amy Carroll. You can find Amy Carroll's Bible study online at amycarroll.org. That's amycarroll.org. You can buy her book at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's on proverbs31.org, and it seems to be a really good book, isn't it, Rosa?
Oh, definitely, because I find that perfectionism is something that is so easy to fall into, and it does disrupt relationships. It alienates us. It keeps us from a loving relationship with God. And so I would encourage you, check that out. Go to the online Bible study. Go to amycarroll.org. They have some fun things. They have a private Facebook group. Lots of fun things. You're going to want to get involved in that. You can find Joe and I. We can find our blog at www.lifeinsidethehouseontherock.com. You can find me on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Rosa Hopkins Writing. And so I would encourage everybody to get rid of perfect. Leave it behind. It's no fun.
I can't do that. I married perfect.
Well, that's really good. You get some bonus points for that one for sure. So thank you so much for tuning in, and God willing, we'll catch you next week.